Hi, I'm Alex Howard, and welcome to Conscious 2. My guest in the studio today is Dr. Robin Wood. Hi, Robin.
Hi there, Alex.
And Robin is the author of several books, including, to be, I think, published around the time you watched this interview, The Trouble with Paradise. And Robin has fascinating background, having been involved in many different things, lived in many different places, some of which we may well come into today's interview. Robin, I wanted to start with, I was reading in the book that September the 11th was a pretty big turning point in your life. Three big things happened to you in a short sequence. Talk us through that.
Well, absolutely. As you say, I grew up congenitally optimistic about the world and the chances of progress resolving many of, not all of our problems at some point. And in that role, I was working mainly on what we call today corporate transformation for many years. And thinking that if we could just get that right, if we could fine-tune it, scale it, that we would actually end up in a kind of a paradisical kind of globalization, a beneficial globalization for all. So that was really what I was working on in the 90s, the 80s and the 90s. It's my project. And part of that was related to technology, the internet, and the vision of what I saw of moving beyond entrepreneurial and managerial to collaborative capitalism, as I called it in the book, Managing Complexity. And that was 14 years ago that came out. And the vision of collaborative capitalism was a world which worked for everyone, basically. However, it was clear that when those two towers fell on 9/11 in New York, as I stood there in my living room in London, speechless, as I think most people were at the time, a thought flashed through my mind which went something like this: it's over. This whole game is over. And for the first time in my life, I didn't have a plan. I couldn't see anything. There was a fog. I think this, as I spoke to people around the world, they said exactly the same thing happened to them. It was like a fog. What happens next? We don't know. There was fear. There was anxiety. And of course, traveling by air became a complete nightmare.
Right. And it was the first time in decades, in a sense, there was a kind of the world shook in a sense of war. We hadn't, maybe in the Western world, not been on our doorstep. And suddenly something was fundamentally different.
Well, we'd never been attacked. I mean, since 1939 and the end of the Second World War, exactly.
US,
So the modern world had been fairly insulated from the chaos in the latter half of the 20th century. So it came home to us that we were vulnerable. And not only that, but it seemed to me at the time that it was also saying something about our whole civilization. It was giving us some serious feedback.
And of course, we should say that September 11th wasn't just what happened in the external world, but in your internal life.
Well, exactly. At the time, literally a week after September 11, my ex-wife and I decided on an amicable separation because we'd been going in different ways. And literally a week after that happened, my father died. So adding to that the fact my internet company had merged with another internet company, and I was temporarily had sufficient funds available not to rush out and take the first job that came along. For the first time in my very busy achiever strategist life, I had the opportunity to sit back and think, what do I really want? What's needed now? What should I be doing that can take the next generations to a whole different level? Because I've done what I've done, I've proven what I can do, and I'm very happy with that. I had that sense of fulfillment from my career. But in my personal life, I was recognizing that the corporate transformations we were bringing about were, at best, quite shallow. And that if I wasn't going to access something deeper inside my own self, I wasn't going to be able to deepen what work I was doing.
So what happened from that place? So it's a big question, and also it sounds like there was the potential for something to open. What unfolded from that?
Well, it's, as they say, timing is everything in life and love. I had picked up a copy of Spiral Dynamics sitting in an office of a very large corporation in Hong Kong doing business transformation in 1996. And my colleague, who was then the head of change at this large corporation, had come back from Dallas, Texas and said, "You've got to read this book." He said, "This is amazing stuff." He said, "It explains so much about what we're doing in the different countries in Asia, particularly at different stages of development. And, you know, transformation is very, very important that you get the values and the culture right along with the vision and the whole change process, so that it's a natural flow process, not a forced change process, which is always very harmful and causes a great deal of suffering." So I grabbed this book with open arms. For 4 years, John and I were the two people on earth who spoke blue, green, orange, purple, red, you know, the different colors of the spiral to each other. Other people thought we were slightly mad. But we had the maps, you know.
Yeah.
And I had luckily I completed a PhD at London Business School in 1995 on organizational alignment.
Uh-huh.
And it turned out that I had an interior quadrant of 4 key things and an exterior quadrant, collective quadrants. And I got a 0.8 correlation between 10 years of strategic performance, i.e. not just financial, which is very low because it's manipulated. Strategic performance is really what you do out there in the market, your quality, the things that really matter to you and your stakeholders, right? Not just superficial making some money. And there was a 0.8 correlation between that and alignment in 30 of the world's largest companies that I studied over 8 years.
And when you say alignment, what do you mean by that?
Well, alignment actually on the diagrams, the statistical approach I took, is actually a perfect circle. It doesn't exist because nothing's perfectly aligned in the universe. But Rank Xerox, for example, was a wonderful example. They were the furthest out. They were the first green organization I'd seen. Yeah.
And when you say green, you mean pluralistic? You mean
yes,
in
pluralistic,
the sense of
exactly.
listening to multiple perspectives.
World-centric, going beyond. What had triggered that was the whole quality movement and process management, and bringing in Deming's profound knowledge approaches and so on.
Yes.
And that really had transformed the culture in Xerox to one which could have dialogue and transformative conversations. Of course, it doesn't penetrate any corporation beyond a certain depth, but it does get you from A to B, even if you've still got to keep on going to C and D and E. So at the other extreme, I had some very clearly red businesses that were totally opportunistic.
And to say red, you mean?
Egocentric, driven by charismatic individuals, power-based.
Right. I win, you lose.
Yeah,
well, that's what matters.
It would be nice to have a win-win, but if we can't, that's too bad.
That's it. Be a bonus.
So, and then the sort of more conventional, what we call blue or the diplomat type organizations, which don't want conflict, they just want everything to run smoothly, but often that carries a very high price because they don't change and adapt.
Right.
And then
follow the rules, don't change the rules. That's
no, exactly. Whatever you do, just hang on to the way we've done things, forever.
Yeah.
And because that's always worked, so let's just keep on doing that. And then your strategic achiever kind of organizations, what are called Orange and Spiral Dynamics, which is basically the people who've got some kind of vision, some kind of goal, some kind of strategy, and now they're looking, how do I align the organization around that? And that was really where the corporate transformation movement started. But it was very clear that as soon as people got from strategic achiever mode into the world-centric, team bond mode, that often the corporate immune system rejected them.
Yes.
And they'd then go off and become consultants. So the most frustrating part of my job
so
was that I would find fantastic clients who'd work together for a number of years, and then they'd realize, what am I doing in this horrific big organization? I should be out there transforming, other easier to transform organizations.
Yeah, it's a really funny thing that it's like people, they kind of burn out in the corporate world and think, right, I'm going to leave the corporate world to have something, more sustainable, more connected. But the sad thing is that awakening, then it leaves the corporate world and that potential to provide.
You take that out of the field of the corporate world and it no longer can shift anything in that world. And that's been the dilemma that to some extent in my life. So by the time 9/11 happened, I'd seen this so many times in many global corporations, from being excited about what John Brown was doing at BP to being totally disappointed when they bought Amoco and watched that whole culture go down the tubes. having spent 5 years inside Hewlett Packard between 95 when the internet really took off to 2000, and then watching Carly Fiorina destroy probably one of the finest culture, values-driven organizations, the HP Way,
Yes.
in a matter of 2 years with Compaq takeover. So two of my finest clients and all the great people and work we'd done bit the dust, along with the two buildings in New York at the
Must
World
have been
Trade Center.
incredibly frustrating.
Boom. The whole dot-com thing bit the dust. And I was sitting left in the dust, going, in the whirlwind, going, what's next?
Right.
And I went to Boulder, Colorado for a Spiral Dynamics program in 2001, literally a month after 9/11.
How did you get there? If you don't mind? Flying was pretty challenging.
Yeah,
at the time,
luckily, no, I'd given a speech in Munich or Frankfurt, I think it was, to some conference, and the day after 9/11, only half the people showed up, no Americans. And then I got back to London, and then luckily by the time I got to, I was able to fly to America on BA. And so we all arrived there in Boulder, Colorado for a full week of intensive spiral dynamics, and then some time with Ken Wilber. And I'd been reading, as I said, spiral dynamics since '96 and working with it, and I'd picked up copies of Wilber's work in Californian bookstores, over the years, but always found them to be so heavy, literally heavy.
They're doorstops, if you
Yeah,
like.
they're massive books, and clearly genius intellect
Right.
to produce this kind of stuff. That until he brought out the Theory of Everything book, he hadn't really crystallized the psychoactive part of Integral.
Which effectively was a synthesis of sex ecology and spirituality, which was the kind of
Correct.
the seminal piece in a sense.
Exactly. So he really, with that one book, he crystallized it for a whole new level of people. I'm a very practical person, so I always look at anything from the perspective of, A, does it work? Where does it work? Where might it not work, of course? Because there's never one silver bullet, one size fits all solution. B, I look literally through books to find things that have worked and that I can pick up and use tomorrow, and that with clients and so on who need this stuff desperately.
Yes.
And so that's what I've been doing throughout my career, and for the first time I thought, okay, this Integral thing has actually got legs.
Yeah.
And it's so fascinating and fabulous to be here in Budapest with, somewhere between 300 to 400 brilliant people, but also with big hearts, doing amazing work that is deeply transformative.
Yeah.
Seeing the body of Integral emerging in Europe, let alone around the world.
Sure.
Yeah.
Sure. And I'm curious to come to. I know that another significant life change for you was moving to the Pyrenees in France. And
Yes.
I believe that was part of the inspiration of the title "Trouble with Paradise."
Yeah,
This kind of
exactly.
moving to paradise, and the reality perhaps being a little different. So I'm curious to hear about that.
Well, let's see.
Well, we should say you live in a very beautiful chateau.
Exactly, it's a very beautiful place, and I, having spent, excuse me, having spent about sort of 20, 25 years in the corporate world, and flying around the world, working in 35 different countries, 4 different continents, I had a sort of a yearning for somewhere that I could retreat, literally, because retreat has not been a feature of my life almost at all. I've been out there in the action, sleeves rolled up.
Right.
And so I was it was, ironically, it's always an event that triggers these things, I don't know why. I was
nervous what happens this weekend.
Exactly. My goodness, what's going to happen next? Please, But Don Beck asked myself and a lovely lady called Dr. Mary Key to put together a scaffolding for a workshop that he does every year called the Spiral Dynamics Confab in Dallas, Texas, of all places. And I was staying at the Harvey Hotel, which didn't have terribly happy memories for me as a kid watching JFK being assassinated. But anyway, I hope it wasn't related to him. But it was not what I'd call paradise, but it was like hell, actually. The freeways, just big cars, people driving fast, no humanity. I felt very empty, but it was weird. This vision emerged in the hotel we were running the Spiral Dynamics event, which had all these beautiful people there. Again, it's the people that make all the difference, And so I had as it happened, some lady from Santa Barbara who offered to do me some light therapy, which I'd heard of because I've always been a bit of a new age. I love floating, swimming with dolphins, all that stuff. Yes, I'm a bit of a sop, I know.
I didn't say anything.
Call me a wimp, I do the stuff.
You're a modern man.
I don't talk about it. I'm a sensitive new age guy sometimes.
Yeah, sure. It sounds really healthy.
Yeah, it is. It is, and except when you're out there in the corporate world and
you have to armor up a little bit.
Yeah, you have to be careful who you tell about what. so yeah, there I was, and after this light therapy thing, I began to get images in my head. In fact, it was when I was lying there in this Harvey hotel having this therapy of a beautiful place between the mountains and the sea with palm trees, and I don't know where the heck this was, but. And I said to this colleague of mine who was running this workshop at the Confab, I said, it's just so strange. I've had the weirdest set of visions, and I keep on getting them about this place, and they're similar to what I got in meditation back in London when I was sitting there every morning. Then I started drawing, meditational drawing. And I said, I don't know where it is, but it's like the message is, I've got to go create my own little corner of paradise, an oasis, because if the world is a desert spiritually, we've got to go and get some water sometime. The camels are going to need water. I mean, we're all going to need to, because there's going to be a long way between this oasis and the next one. And we're all thirsty. So I literally had a picture of camels and palm trees and stuff. I did myself as a business guy would do a little business plan.
Why not?
I then recce'd, a triangular area between Barcelona, Toulouse, and Montpellier, and got on the internet, and with the help of a few friends, started exploring. Cut a long story short, again, synchronicity played a very big hand in this. It wasn't like I could have planned this. I ended up buying this old derelict chateau. And I was literally doing workshops at some stages where I could almost feel my hands burning to just get my hands on something real. After a decade in the internet space and that kind of world of workshops and hotels and stuff, what you had left to show for your efforts was you could sort of see Hewlett-Packard had changed, or something had happened, or there was a new company that...
But there was something you couldn't touch and
yeah,
feel and
it's
taste.
behind a sort of silicon screen, it's not real. Yeah. So I've got to get back in my... I've always been a very physical person. I want to get back in my body, get out back into nature and reconnect, spiritually and with nature, and bring people to a beautiful place where they can relax, first of all, just shed the city dust off them, refresh after a few days. They'll feel totally in a different space, and then start reinventing themselves, their whatever. So over the last 10 years, we've run a lot of workshops, including some integral workshops and some big events, a few hundred people, and that's been very instructive. However, there is trouble in paradise, as the book suggests.
I was going to say, as the book suggests. So what's been the trouble, or what surprised you about? Because you clearly created that beautiful space. So what happened?
Well, if the universe really wants to challenge you, it gives you what you ask for. It fulfills your dreams. So be careful what you ask for. I asked for a corner of paradise to create it, and I thought, I'm prepared. I've done some building development before, and I draw plans, and I quite like sort of being sort of the architect and styles and Philippe Starck, this and that. And I had a designer and an architect working with me. So that was great. That was a really positive part of it. Getting things done, seeing transformation happen physically inside of the space and in the gardens. But then, as Sartre said, hell is other people, right? And particularly because you're coming from an Anglo-Saxon culture. I hadn't realized just how, even though I was in Silicon Valley or Hong Kong or South Africa, wherever they spoke, even Scandinavians, where they speak English, it's pretty much the same world. You take it for granted. You may speak a language or two here and there, try and speak a bit of French, try and speak a bit of Dutch or whatever, as I try to do before I moved. And you take all that for granted. You're the fish swimming in the water, unaware of the culture you're in. And suddenly I was in this completely almost opposite culture to the one I'd taken for granted most of my life. And it forced me in some ways to slow down, which is a good thing. in other ways, it was incredibly frustrating because I couldn't plan, I couldn't make things happen as I was used to making things happen in that way. And so I had to let go of a lot of things, a lot of expectations. So that was the first frustration. And I was reasonably successful at doing that. But the second thing about Paradise is there's snakes and things in the garden, you know. They're
Literally or metaphorically?
well, actually, luckily, it was mainly metaphorical snakes. But that will creep up on you and bite you in the ankle when you least expect it. I mean, I probably don't need to tell Francois Hollande that France is broken. I think he knows that already. And certainly the French know it.
Yeah.
He's got the lowest opinion poll rating of any French president in history,
Yeah.
25%. And the problem is that I had never bargained for the fact that the French system is pretty much order-destructing itself. And you couldn't really encapsulate modernism and its perils in a culture better than the way the French have done it.
Yeah.
They have taken modernism and then postmodernism to their absolute limits. They've hollowed us out in that sense in their culture. And the French people are desperate. They really are empty. And they have no hope, which is even more depressing. And of course, they're desperate for cash, so that when you own a chateau, they think you're rich and they immediately start trying to tax you on everything. And so we've had a bit of a battle to literally to keep the thing afloat for for a while, because most of the money you make in France goes to the government.
90%.
It's
in some ways.
It's horrific. It's horrific. I'm not I look and sound like I'm some kind of rich guy. I'm not.
Sure.
I'm a self-made person who counts every penny, you know, as I did when I was a small kid selling stuff door to door, you know. So those are some of the examples. But here's the thing I learned: as soon as you think you've hacked something in life, you can be absolutely sure that you will be presented with the next notch up of the challenge.
Yeah.
So you think, hey, I've got my kind of anger management and need to get things done, you know, very strategic achiever mentality, right? Under control. I'm not going to I'm just going to breathe in and breathe out and let things flow. And if they don't go out my way, but then something else will come along and it'll be a much bigger challenge. You can't just go, oh, just breathe in and breathe out. Now you're thinking, oh my goodness me, how do I sort this out?
You suddenly realize the previous stuff was just the training.
Yeah, it was just a training camp,
Right.
boot camp. Now you're actually out there for real.
Right.
And now a lot depends on this, and it's not just you that's going to be affected by the outcomes.
Yeah.
And that is, I was going to say, frightening beyond all belief, in the sense that you know that if it goes pear-shaped, you're responsible.
Yeah.
And when you're on the line as a leader, and that's when I suddenly realized what Arie de Geest at Shell, who was one of the first sort of turquoise leaders, you know, I'd ever really met. This guy was just an alchemist, a magician, and I could never figure out exactly how he did it, which is exactly why they're called alchemists and magicians.
Sure.
But he could make things happen in big corporations, in the World Bank, and sustainability and things in the Rio, and we just worked with him, and it was just like magic.
Yeah.
Things came together, they worked. And so Arie had always said, you know, Robin, when you sit in a boardroom, he said, there's fear of the consequences. 5 billion here, 10 billion there, you make a small mistake here, it's going to come back and hit you. Just look what happened to BP in the Gulf of Mexico. $40 billion later. So there are big, big consequences in making these decisions. And I think a lot of people don't quite fully understand, having probably most people have never been inside a boardroom, just quite how tense it can get.
You see, we haven't got much time left, but it's a really interesting point, and something that's fascinated me over the years is how those that haven't experienced that kind of environment, how easy it is to have a childlike relationship to the failing parent, and to not realize the weight and the challenge. And so, talk about the trouble with Paradise. Sometimes the challenge of Paradise is the weight of responsibility and the weight of difficult decisions.
Yeah, and I that's how I kind of got into my current line of work, if you can call it that, Thrivability, because it suddenly occurred to me, you know, we've had orange and green intention. We've had this sort of, and everybody knows what the green world looks like. It's Greenpeace and 350.org and the things I love and I've always supported. I've always been a greenie inside my whole life, yeah. And on the other hand, we've got the strategic achiever world that's still very oriented around, value added, even though they're talking about shared value added now. But the problem is there's no real comparability. You can still get away with murder, literally, in the corporate world and pretend to be sustainable. So, to cut a long story short, I've started working with some of the leaders in that field to try to create what we're calling the Thrivability Index. I'll talk a bit more about that tomorrow. And to make it so that every single decision that is taken in a boardroom or whether it's an NGO, or a big corporation, the World Bank, the UN, doesn't matter, that decision and its outcomes can be measured to some extent by the ability of that decision to create the maximum amount of thrival for the maximum amount of number of people related to the attached footprint. Because right now we're making decisions in isolation. On the one hand, we want paradise. We want, we just want all this bad news stuff to be over with because we know we don't have to do this. We kind of know that intrinsically. Everybody knows this is crazy, what we're doing. But we don't know how to stop the train. It's just running headlong towards the cliff. On the other hand, we're saying, man, we can reduce footprint. There's technologies. We can do this. We can do that and the other. Solar, this, renewables, and a million other things. The problem is these decisions are being taken as if they're separate, and they're not. They're completely interrelated. So when we say, we've got to be here by 2050, 1.1 planet's maximum, resource usage. Here we are in 2014, and we're heading towards, we'd be lucky to be heading there. We're not going to hit this. There's this gap. So this is the work we've been doing for 5 years with Renaissance 2 has made this very, very clear. And so we need a whole new approach to how we measure impact. And thrival has to be included as an impact. Because it motivates people. Because you can then say, hey, well, how could you lead a lifestyle that would give you more for less and not cost the earth? It's totally doable.
It's a great slogan, more for less and doesn't cost the earth.
Yeah.
We're out of time, Robin. There's a lot more we could get into here, but it's been great. And thank you for your time.
Thank you very much.
And thank you for watching. And we look forward to talking with you again, hopefully very soon. Bye-bye.